Although you may not be able to see them, two of our friends are inviting us today to open our hearts during this time of worship. One of those is imagination, and the other is ministry. I thought about them and I said we might give them names. For example, we might name imagination Philippe Imaginari, and we might name ministry Grace Greatheart. But both of them are going to have something to say to us during our time of worship today. It'll be a word of encouragement, it will be a word of challenge, but we will hear from both of them. The first of them who will speak to us is imagination. And as he speaks to us, he picks up some words from Jesus out of the Gospel of Matthew. That occasion, one of those occasions really, when Jesus said, "The person who has ears to hear ought to use them." Well, we Westerners have often had a hard time with what we call imagination. It's had a bad rap with us, if you want to know the truth. And in this religious tribe that we call Baptists, sometimes it seems that people make imagination and heresy synonyms. But at the same time, there are many people who offer words of encouragement and help when we come to think about imagination. We are reminded that it can be our friend. It is a way for us to see new possibilities, a way for us to experience a catalyst that moves us out of a difficult time in our lives. Imagination is a way to have a creative force that is at work in our personal lives and in social change as well. So let's start with a simple definition. Imagination is the ability to see more than meets the eye. One writer suggests that imagination has a voice, and it sounds like this. I am imagination. I can see what the eye cannot see. I can hear what the ears cannot hear. I can feel what the heart cannot feel. And so imagination can well be a good part of life for us, but at the same time, we may wonder what imagination has to do with ministry. And so I invite you to hear some words of Scripture that will set the stage for our understanding something of the relationship between imagination and ministry.
Jesus realized that the Pharisees were keeping count of the baptisms that he and John performed, although his disciples, not Jesus, did the actual baptizing. They had posted the score that Jesus was ahead, turning him and John into rivals in the eyes of the people. So Jesus left the Judean countryside and went back to Galilee. To get there, he had to pass through Samaria. He came into Sychar, a Samaritan village that bordered the field Jacob had given his son Joseph. Jacob's well was still there. Jesus, worn out by the trip, sat down at the well. It was noon.
As you look around right now, wouldn't you say that in about 4 months it will be time to harvest? Well, I'm telling you to open your eyes and take a good look at what's right in front of you. These Samaritan fields are ripe. It's harvest time.
A woman, a Samaritan, came to draw water. Jesus said, "Would you give me a drink of water?" His disciples had gone to the village to buy food for lunch. The Samaritan woman, taken aback, asked, "How come you, a Jew, are asking me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" Jews in those days wouldn't be caught dead talking to Samaritans. Jesus answered, If you knew the generosity of God and who I am, you would be asking me for a drink, and I would give you fresh, living water."
As you look around right now, wouldn't you say that in about 4 months it will be time to harvest? Well, I'm telling you to open your eyes and take a good look at what's right in front of you. These Samaritan fields are ripe. It's harvest time.
Just then, his disciples came back. They were shocked. They couldn't believe he was talking with that kind of woman. No one said what they were all thinking, but their faces showed it. The woman took the hint and left. In her confusion, she left her water pot.
As you look around right now, wouldn't you say that in about 4 months it will be time to harvest? Well, I'm telling you to open your eyes and take a good look at what's right in front of you. These Samaritan fields are ripe. It's harvest time.
Back in the village, she told the people, "Come, see a man who knew all about the things I did, who knows me inside and out. Do you think this could be the Messiah?" And they went out to see for themselves.
As you look around right now, wouldn't you say that in about 4 months it will be time to harvest? Well, I'm telling you to open your eyes and take a good look at what's right in front of you. These Samaritan fields are ripe. It's harvest time.
Many of the Samaritans from that village committed themselves to him because of what the woman's witness was. They asked him to stay on. So Jesus stayed 2 days. A lot more people entrusted their lives to him when they heard what he had to say.
As you look around right now, wouldn't you say that in about 4 months it will be time to harvest? Well, I'm telling you to open your eyes and take a good look at what's right in front of you. These Samaritan fields are ripe. It's harvest time.
And we're reminded that Jesus had a remarkable capacity for setting a challenge and for pointing to opportunities. Here he is in Samaria, traveling north toward home. He really has hot-footed it out of Judea for his own welfare and the welfare of his movement. And now they are standing on the edge of Samaria, and he says to his disciples, "I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest." That is a word about possibilities, and that is a word of challenge. In Galilee, a bit later, he is moving along and comes to a point in which he sees Matthew, a tax collector, in the tax booth, and he says to him, "Follow me." That's the challenge. It is bold. It is direct. It is filled with forthright challenge. And then just a bit along the way, a few paragraphs later, Jesus and his disciples are near Jerusalem, and Jesus says to his disciples as he sees the crowd, the harvest is full of possibilities, and that is his word for us. So Jesus wants us to know that we have possibilities around us when we are close to home and when we are in hostile territory. He wants us to know that when the crowds are milling around us and when we're dealing with individuals alike, we are faced with possibilities and opportunities. In Samaria, we see the opportunities in a lonely, marginalized, a woman who is casting about in life looking for something and is making her way along the drudgery of daily life. In Galilee, on the other hand, we see the opportunities in people who are harassed and are hurt and helpless, and they are much like a sheep without a shepherd. In both instances, Jesus is telling us that wherever we might find ourselves, there are possibilities for ministry by us and through our lives and through our hands, even when we are in places we think we would rather not be. So let's take a look at this story of the Samaritan woman. We may find Jesus' conversation with this woman a bit hard for us to get hold of. Some of us have heard or read colorful, biblically unwarranted descriptions of this woman. And those are distortions that make it difficult for us to see and to hear like we might need to do or want to do. But Jesus invites us to see this Samaritan woman in a way that we might not have seen her before. Perhaps she is just old and has outlived 5 husbands. I remember that I served a church once in which one of our members had been married 4 times. I performed the wedding ceremony for 2 of those times, and I conducted the funeral for 2 of those husbands. And so here was a woman in our time who had outlived 4 of her husbands. And it may well be that the 5 husbands that are mentioned in the story of the Samaritan woman are men who have died. But in this instance, this Samaritan woman had given up on marriage and now was living with a man without benefit of a marriage contract. But there's another option. Maybe she was the victim of an ancient, oppressive, patriarchal way of life. In the ancient world, only men could divorce women. Some rabbis argued that a man could divorce his wife with any just cause. Maybe her 5 husbands had found in her something lacking, something unsuitable, something unlovely, something unfit for their desires. And so they simply cast her aside and turned in another direction. So what the woman may have needed was redemption from a series of injustices from 5 husbands in a culture that was programmed for male domination. Or it may be that this was a woman who used her language as a way to shield herself and keep herself from being vulnerable. She asked questions. It may well be that the questions that she asked of Jesus were genuine questions, but it may also be that they were rhetorical or defensive or diversionary, that they were used as a way to keep this man at arm's length from her. However we might see her, here is a woman whose life has been lived in pieces, broken relationships, a series of marriages, social oppression, poverty, and known gossip. And guess what we see? She is the center of Jesus' interest and attention in this little scene that we've heard read this morning. And so here, Jesus is inviting us to see possibilities wherever we might be, even when we are living in a place where we think we really don't want to be. Well, Wanda and I lived in our Samaria for almost 10 years. Back then, we knew that we would be moving, but we did not know where we would be moving. And then the chair of a pastor search committee called and wanted to talk with me and wanted to visit with us. The church had a notable history, but it was deeply mired in terrible trouble and conflict. The church also presented a problem for me. It was located in the middle of the state where I had grown up. It was in the middle of the state where I had once already served a pastorate. And there was a problem for me in all of that. The people who lived there were still fighting the war of northern aggression, as they called it. And like ancient Jonah, I thought that I did not want to live there again. I did not want to be a part of that culture again. But I listened to the chair. And I listened to the committee, and I connected and counseled with friends. And Wanda and I decided that we would visit beyond and some more. And so we decided to investigate, we decided to explore, and we made our first visit. We flew in on a commercial airplane, one of those in which every seat is an aisle seat and every seat is a window seat. You've been on them, I know. And so we flew in like that. And as we approached the airport, I looked down, and for all that I could think of, I saw it as a kind of postage stamp out there in the middle of a wooded area. And so we landed, we began to explore. But the first stage of our visit did not ease my reluctance about being there. We drove eastward from Alexandria across the Red River and into the city of Pineville along Main Street. And as we drove along, everything that I saw shouted, old and tired. Everything said what was isn't now. Everything that I saw suggested that there's not much promise here. And so my heart sank, and I felt a bit disheartened. But we talked with the committee and we explored the area. We talked with people who knew the church and its history and people who knew us. We talked with our Heavenly Father. The committee came to hear me preach in a nearby city, and we spent the lunch hour and most of the afternoon talking about church and ministry. 2 members of the committee then later flew to Nashville to visit with us in our home. And during that process, I ran across again the scripture that we have read this morning. Here, Jesus chooses his entourage, and he chooses to take his entourage of 5 disciples with him to the north and through Samaria rather than around it. Samaria, you remember, was peopled with half-breed people and with people who were despised by good, upright, uptight kinds of Jewish people. And so Jesus and his disciples make their way into Samaria. Jesus decides to stop at a famous roadside park to rest and to have some water. And then while he is there, he meets this woman, and he begins to carry on a conversation. And his disciples saw him doing something that no respectable rabbi would ever do, talking to a woman in public, talking to a Samaritan woman, talking to a woman who in the eyes of the law was a sinner, talking with a woman who was likely ostracized by her townspeople. And before long, a group of the locals came to see and to hear Jesus. And when that part of the story comes to an end, they invite Jesus to come and stay with them. And to the shock of his disciples, they go, and Jesus becomes their house guest for 2 days. It is in that setting that Jesus says, "Look at the fields." Those are Jesus' words. Jesus calling his disciples to recognize the potential for ministry around them. Jesus urging his disciples to see possibilities wherever they might be. Jesus beckoning his disciples to see potential even when they find themselves in a place they have no desire to be. Jesus saying, enlist your imagination in the service of your calling. Jesus saying, faith without imagination is lifeless. Jesus is calling his disciples to see possibilities in ministry wherever they are, even when they are in a place they think they do not want to be. So with that biblical story at work in me, Wanda and I made our candidating visit to the congregation. The church, in turn, invited us to become their pastor. And so we went, and we stayed for almost 10 years. 10 years that were regularly demanding, but at the same time were wonderfully blessed and blessing. In central Louisiana, in a church that had been a cauldron of conflict for almost 2 decades, I learned much about imagination and ministry. During that decade, the church embodied Jesus' great commandment and his great commission with new passion. During that decade, the church established an inner-city, multi-ethnic ministry among shuttered buildings and decaying homes and publicly operated medical centers. They launched more than a dozen ministries within the church and within the community and beyond both of those. They ordained its first female minister and ordained its first 3 female deacons. They completed 2 major renovation projects. They freed me and blessed me to invest my time and energies in community leadership opportunities of various kinds. At the beginning, I had stood in Pineville, Louisiana, as the handful of Jesus' disciples had stood at the border between Judea and Samaria. At the beginning, I had looked at that place with eyesight that had been skewed by negative memories and past history, in the very same way the Jews and the Samaritans looked at each other on the basis of colored history. At the same time, I, like the disciples, was being called to minister in a place that I thought I did not want to be. But this story grabbed me. It overcame my reluctance. It refused to let me hold on to my negative memories. It helped me to see fields ripe for the harvest. It opened my eyes to see God at work as surely as those first followers saw him at work in Samaria. Remember this. Jesus is calling his disciples to see the potential for ministry wherever they may be, even when they find themselves in places they think they don't want to be. So when you come to Jacob's well, keep your eyes focused on Jesus. You will see imagination and ministry working hand in hand in his actions and in his relationships. Jesus recognizes potential in this woman and in the Samaritans. Jesus resists deeply embedded prejudices on both sides, the cultural, religious, historical divisions and barriers. Jesus is the voice of hope and the agent of reconciliation. Jesus is immensely generous in his actions and his relationships. He enlists partners in his mission, first the 5, then the woman, and then the townsfolk. He reaches out to people who are marginalized and at risk, and he brings to life the ancient, treasured images from the scriptures that were shared by the Samaritans and the Jews alike. Some of you know of Will Campbell. Will Campbell was Mississippi-born, a Louisiana Baptist educated man, author of 2 books at least, one of them 40 Acres and a Mew, and the other Brother to a Dragonfly. Well, Campbell was a rough-edged, irascible Baptist minister who was active in the civil rights movement in its most violent days back in the 1960s. At one point, a friend wrote to Campbell and expressed some concern about Campbell's acrobatics, and no one had ever accused him of being an acrobat, and so he was sort of irritated by that, but he was also intrigued a little by that. And so soon after, he attended a circus. And in the circus, he watched the trapeze artist up high, the ground and on the high wire, he watched that and he thought about what was said in the letter. And then when the circus ended that day, he made his way to the area where the performers would be, and he found the young man that he had seen up there on the high wire. And he struck up a conversation with him. And in the conversation, he asked him a question about that. And the young man said to him that it was highly exciting to be up there on the high wire and to be involved in all of the action that was going on there. But he also confessed that being up there was terribly frightening and dangerous. And so Campbell then asked him, well, why do you stay up there then? And he answered in this way, my sister is up there and she's just crazy. My wife is up there and she's irresponsible. And my father is up there and he's older now than he was when we began, and his reflexes aren't quite what they ought to be. And so I go up there and I can be ready when the time comes to hold out a hand and grab hold and help if need be. Well, Campbell started to turn away from the young man in the conversation, and he stopped and asked him, well, why do they stay up there? And the young man answered with a bit of uneasiness, well, you see, mister, I kind of have this drinking problem. Well, here's the heart of it. You and I are called to hang in and to hold on and to live in those risky, scary places like Samaria so that we can offer a hand of help and a word of grace and invitation. You and I are called then to be in places that we may not want to be. We're called to be in places where our weaknesses are obvious. We're called to be in places where we can offer a hand to be helpful to others. And the question then, in part, becomes, dare you let the Bible seed your imagination in ministry? Will you let its best stories seed your imagination in ways that take root and change the course of your life and shift your view of the world? Will you pay attention to what is written there and let it push you out into the world?